right, so today we're diving into a sermon that really hits on a feeling we all know, right? This feeling of living in a world that's just constantly changing. I mean, we're all looking for some kind of anchor, something solid to grab onto when things get crazy. And well, this sermon suggests there is one. And this really is this central question, isn't it? It gets right to the heart of what so many of us feel. I mean, if everything around us is always in motion, can we really hold on to anything? Is there anything out there that's truly stable? So, the sermon kicks off by painting a picture that, let's be honest, is super familiar. Our world is just turbulent, always in motion. You think about it, from our gadgets to our friendships, nothing seems to stay put for very long. And this isn't just some vague feeling, you know? The sermon gives some really concrete examples. That super powerful phone or computer you bought just a couple of years back, yeah, it's probably already obsolete. The big news story from this morning, it's already been buried by the next thing. The source even points out that the very same people who lift you up today might be the ones to tear you down tomorrow. It's just a dizzying pace to live at. So, faced with all this craziness, what's the answer? Well, this is where the sermon presents its big idea. It argues that the one true anchor for our constantly shifting lives is found in a God who, by his very nature, doesn't change. Now, there's a big theological word for this: immutability. It sounds kind of intimidating, I know, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. It just means that God is always the same. His core being, his character, his big picture plans, none of it changes or evolves over time. And to make this easier to grasp, the sermon breaks his whole idea down into three main pillars. You've got his unchanging essence, like who he is. Then there are his unchanging attributes, which is his character. And finally, his unchanging counsel, which are his purposes. So let's take a quick look at each of these. Okay, first up, his essence or his being. The source explains it like this: because God is infinite, he can't change. Think about it. He can't get any better because he's already perfect, and he can't decay or get worse. This quote from Exodus, "I am that I am," man, that just captures it perfectly. It's a statement of pure, timeless, unchanging existence. And this same idea applies directly to God's character too. You know, his attributes aren't like our moods that can change from one day to the next. The sermon actually uses this great Latin phrase, semper idem, which just means always the same. His power, his wisdom, his love, his mercy, they're permanent parts of who he is. They don't fade. Okay, but you might be thinking, hold on a minute. Doesn't the Bible sometimes talk about God repenting or changing his mind? And that is a fantastic question. The sermon tackles this one head on. What about those verses where it really looks like he's changing his mind, like with the story of Nineveh? So the sermon makes a really crucial distinction here. It argues that what's changing isn't God's eternal nature or his purpose. What's changing is his dealings with people based on their change. So when the people of Nineveh changed their ways, God's response to them changed. This wasn't a change in his character. It was perfectly consistent with his unchanging mercy. His fundamental nature stayed the same, but his actions shifted because the people did. All right, now this is where the whole idea gets really compelling. The source argues that this doctrine of an unchanging God, it's not simple. It's actually a kind of double-edged sword, because depending on where you stand with this God, his unchangeableness is either the most comforting news you could ever hear or the most terrifying thing imaginable. And you can see this tension played out perfectly in two stories. On the one hand, you've got King Saul. He disobeys God and he's terrified. He is desperately hoping that God will change his mind and call off the judgment. But then on the other hand, you have the people of Israel. They are clinging to the hope that God will not change his mind because they're counting on him to keep his promises and save them. And this is the verse that was spoken right to King Saul's face. For him, these words were like a hammer blow. It meant his fate was sealed. There was no changing it. See, God's word of judgment was just as unchangeable as his word of promise. But then you flip it, and you look at this verse spoken to Israel. For them, this exact same truth was their only hope. The only reason they weren't totally wiped out despite all their mess-ups was precisely because God doesn't change. His promises held firm. It's the exact same idea, the same doctrine, but it feels completely different depending on which side you're on. So this all leads to the ultimate puzzle that the sermon tries to solve. How can both of these things be true at the same time? If God is unchangingly just, then sin has to be punished. But if he's also unchangingly merciful, then sinners need to be saved. How could he possibly do both of those things without compromising who he is? And right here is the sermon's central answer. It argues that there's one single point in all of history where these two unchanging truths, his justice and his mercy, meet and are both perfectly satisfied at the exact same time. And that place is the cross. So let's break that down. The way the sermon explains it is this. God's unchanging holiness meant sin absolutely had to be judged. But his unchanging love provided a substitute, his son Jesus. So God's justice was completely poured out on Jesus, which then allowed his mercy to flow freely to anyone who believes. The point is, he didn't just ignore sin or go soft on it, he judged it completely, just in someone else. Okay, so I know that's some pretty deep theology, but the sermon is very clear that this isn't just some abstract idea to think about. No, this has real, practical, on-the-ground implications for how we actually live our lives in this messy, chaotic world. So what does this actually mean for us? Well, here are the big takeaways. First, because God doesn't change, his promises don't expire or get outdated. That means it provides a truly solid foundation, that anchor we've been talking about. It also calls us to be more steadfast and reliable people ourselves. And yeah, on the other side of the coin, it's a serious warning that his promises of judgment are just as rock solid as his promises of mercy. And this verse from Hebrews just ties it all together so perfectly. The source really emphasizes that this whole idea of an unchanging God is seen most clearly in Jesus Christ, who is presented as that one constant, reliable center point in a world that is just full of shifting ideas and trends. So, to wrap all of this up, the sermon leaves us with one last, really powerful metaphor that I think just brings this whole idea to life. The source compares God to the sun. It's always shining, right? It's constant, it's powerful, it's full of light. If we experience darkness or cold, it's not because the sun suddenly decided to stop being the sun. It's because our little part of the world has turned away from it. And that leaves us with this final provocative thought. The stability is always there. The light is always on. The only thing that ever changes is which way we're facing.